Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here. It's great to be face-to-face. I think it was online for quite some time. As you know, my name is Sarah MacCurtin. I'm lecturing in organisational behaviour. I'm not very technologically savvy, I have to say. But what I'm going to do is present the findings of a study we did on leadership and really looking at the higher level. So it was looking at, we interviewed 80 leaders across Ireland at senior level roles, both regional and global roles across all sectors, and a number of focus groups as well. There will be some overlap. I'll try not to repeat too much of what's been said before, but obviously these are key concerns that are coming up. And also the speakers before me, which I found really enlightening and inspiring. So really what we're looking at here is, the first thing we did was we asked our leaders, what's your underlying philosophy of leadership? You know, because I teach leadership in UL, and you know, there's a trajectory from great man theory in the 1920s, because there was no great women obviously, where you were born a leader, and there was this very individualistic idea of leadership, to now the more kind of shared, distributive, transformational, authentic leadership. And we were heartened to hear that all the leaders really did have a very sophisticated idea of leadership. It was at a collective level. They felt that leadership was, you know, something that was very seamless and fluid. And I think somebody over here asked about followership. And I think that was a very pertinent question, because we forget about followership when we talk about leadership. And a lot of these leaders felt it was as beneficial for them to be a follower as a leader, that they learned as much. So they saw leadership as a process rather than a person, as something that should be shared, not constrained by roles. But there's also a tension there, because in times of crisis, we almost, as followers, revert back to this innate kind of need for that individualistic leader who comes in on the horse and wants to save the day. So often what we think people want, this shared leadership, sometimes there's a resistance there. So there was certainly a very collaborative, dynamic idea of leadership. And many of them felt that their role was to stand back, you know, and let others shine. That very much it was about allowing others to lead. Now, they did note that they were all senior leaders, they were at the end of their journey, and they felt it took them a long time to get to that kind of collective idea of leadership. When they were starting out, it was still very individualistic. And again, the literature would suggest that when we're starting in a role, we focus inwards about ourselves. It's only later that we start thinking about others as such. But, you know, what were the challenges that they were facing? And there will be some overlap, I think, you know, in terms of what we talked about. But one of the things they did mention, and this is something that I've done research in, is the heaviness, or what's called sometimes the weight of leadership in the literature, and the risk associated with leadership. Now, these leaders were at senior levels, and they were very comfortable with this risk. You know, they said, we're aware it's risky, they were comfortable with it, but they were also aware of the people coming, you know, up and who were seeing this heaviness of leadership. And they identified perhaps a reluctance to take up that mantle. I don't know if that's something that you're encountering. So what are the kind of risks that you think are associated with you claiming leadership? You know, and certainly leadership you're always under scrutiny. You are the leaders, people are watching you, particularly under times of crisis. You know, we're like these detectives watching what leaders do. But more so than ever, you know, with social media, you're under scrutiny all the time now. And a lot of these leaders were saying, you know, there was always a risk of failure, but now it's even more so because social media. Many of them felt cancel culture. They felt, you know, unprepared, you know, for some of the challenges of leadership. They felt that if you know, very much sometimes that you were judged in ways, and that was amplified globally in ways that weren't before. So just some of the things they mentioned, and again, these aren't just now, but perhaps have become more so. Things like risk of failure, social loss. We see that with middle management, that sometimes when you're propelled into leadership, people who are your peers are no longer, there's a social loss there. But also at the top, it's lonely, you know, and we'll be looking at the whole thing of social capital and how COVID meant that many of those, you know, connections were gone. It is lonely at the top very often. So the risk of social loss, the risk of responsibility. So many of them said, yes, we're responsible for our company, but now more than ever, I feel responsible for my people's mental health. And that was something that really came out, that they were being required to have skills that perhaps they weren't previously. And obviously things like accountability. So what were the key challenges that these leaders were identifying? And again, we've talked about this, and I think it does need to be said so many times. You know, the technology has brought so many advantages. We couldn't have done this research without technology. Before I would have gone around the country in my car interviewing people, it wouldn't have dawned on me to do it, you know, over Teams. Whereas we had to, and it meant we got 80 interviews that we otherwise wouldn't in that period of time. But it also has meant that these leaders are really struggling to build a culture of connectivity. And I won't labour that point because we've talked about it a lot. But the whole thing of you know, trying to get people to feel they belong to an organisation is very difficult when you're distributed. You know, when you're not meeting each other, you know, in a physical location. And what they felt was happening here was things like social capital, intellectual capital. They had to now think strategically about how to build that in ways that perhaps you didn't before. So those spontaneous moments of creativity. Creativity is hard to, you know, I remember in the University of Limerick, we built this pod where we're going to be creative, and it's like you jump in and you go, ooh, you know, you become creative, and then you jump out again. And we don't want that. We don't, you know, that's not something you want. But that's very difficult. It's not impossible. And in some ways, technology will help us, but they're struggling to find how do we tap into this so that we can have those spontaneous eureka moments that sometimes aren't so easy in a formal Teams environment. Because let's face it, it is often the conversations outside of the formal meeting where somebody goes, that was great, but it's not going to work because he hates him. And, you know, those kind of learning moments that are best done informally. Also connecting with like-minded, but also not like-minded people. And all of these leaders said they really try hard to talk to people who don't think the same way. And you as leaders have got to be aware that people are telling you what you want to hear a lot of the time. I know we've talked about honesty and transparency, but let's face it, you know, we are human, and the people who work for you filter out the negative information often and give you what you want to hear, no matter how nice a person you are. It does require very conscious effort to get rid of that mindset where we only give good news to our leaders. I've worked a lot in the Defence Forces, and people would say to me, this is a good news organisation. You know, they don't want to hear the bad news. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And a lot of the research on creativity and innovation said that creative people read things that are against how they think. And so often as leaders, we're in this cocoon chambers where we've been told what we want to hear, and you're surrounded by people who are trying to please you, perhaps. And we're also, technology is shooting at us things that we've already tapped into. So Amazon is saying, you read this book, you loved it, here's another. So we're always reading similar things. So we have to search to be more divergent. And they were saying this is even harder now in this time. One of the things, and again, this was in COVID that they found, was hybrid is wonderful. And I know somebody said, you know, are we being all doom and gloom here? It's giving us so much opportunities. But what they did find is that there's inherent inequalities to hybrid. So what they were finding is that there was some people, and this was particularly during COVID, but I don't think it's isolated to COVID, that some people had to be at work. They had to be there. And that they felt this was unfair. Likewise, what these leaders said was that the people who were present were also being identified, sometimes unconsciously, for projects and opportunities because they were there. You know, so that you have this inequality with people being present and not wanting to be, but you'd also people being present and being on hand for opportunities in career development that perhaps those who couldn't be there were not being offered. Another leader identified also inequalities in working space during COVID. We all were suddenly shooted into each other's sitting rooms, and we saw things we never saw before. So some people were on the kitchen table and others had offices. So there was also an inequality in terms of how people did their work, which needs to be recognised. So trying to discuss how we're, this kind of structured flexibility around hybrid. And I know it was mentioned already, and Kieran mentioned thinking about the purpose for bringing us into work. That was very much a key point that these leaders made. We need to try and discuss this and try to get some parity around, people's sense of inequalities. Another thing that came up now, again, these are leaders who are saying this, so maybe the kind of younger voices in the audience might be able to contradict this. But there was a feeling, from these senior leaders that there was a reluctance from the younger generations to take on leadership as it is now, as such. So on the one hand, they were saying we see leadership as collective and distributive. But when they were talking about leadership, they were saying, the younger generation aren't willing to do the 14 hours. They're not willing to, put in the effort. Not quite as blatant as that, but that there was a reluctance to, that the younger generation have different expectations. They want different things out of their careers, and that we need to change what leadership is if they are going to embrace that. And certainly there's research looking at that in terms of gender. Many young girls are saying, no, I don't want to take on leadership. Also, if you look at things like the experiences of Ardennes and Sana Marine, these female leaders who were trailblazers, and the consequences of that, people are rational decision makers, and often they see the losses outweighing the benefits of leadership. So that's, I think, a discussion that needs to be had. And it's something that leaders identify, that they're finding it hard for people to stand up and take it on. So one of the quotes, people's patience to reach leadership roles have diminished. Previous generations, there was a kind of, hierarchy that you have to go through. And Alma talked about that there's almost this expectation of an accelerated career. And I think sometimes for people like myself who've been working for a long time, there can be a judgment around that. And certainly some of the quotes would suggest that they need to get with the picture. But perhaps we need to get with the picture in terms of rewriting what leadership means. So they were some of the kind of main challenges. Some of the skills they identified, and it won't come as any surprise to you, having spent the whole morning here, but all of them stressed that never before were what's kind of erroneously called soft skills. They're so important now, and that often we're not developed, in terms of honing those kind of skills. And I think often we'll espouse that, but we don't really enact it a lot of the time. So what they're looking at is essentially what often falls under emotional intelligence, and that's not being nice or feeling positive emotions. What they've really found, particularly during COVID, was that never more, that they really needed to hone in, not only on their own self-awareness, but how they manage their own emotions with other people. And there's a huge amount of literature on that. And it does lead to things like, real outcomes like turnover and productivity. But firstly, they identified kind of the challenge in developing the skills around self-awareness, because as already mentioned, as leaders, often you're told, what you want to hear. And a key problem that they found was getting feedback. I don't know if that's something that you've encountered. Getting really honest feedback, seeking feedback from people who aren't beholden to you. Because it is one of the challenges. And again, in the Defence Forces, that was a huge challenge, because you've got, a culture of rank and file. And it is very difficult to provide feedback to your leader that may not be all that positive. And also, a key aspect of that is how you react to that feedback. We all think we want to hear certain things, but when we hear it, we react in a certain way. I always say to organizations when we're doing surveys, do you really want to know? And they say, yeah, and then they don't. So do we really want that feedback? And if we're saying we do, we need to be careful how we react to that. So they were very cognizant of that. The kind of things they identified were things like the need for patience. And what they meant by that was that to develop those who are coming up, you need to take the time to allow them to fail. So you need to allow them to lead, but give them leading opportunities where the consequences aren't so huge that failure is not an option. So, being patient, it's almost like, I think of when I'm trying to help my children do their homework, it's much quicker to do it. Well, not if it's maths, but, and there's often that tendency to micromanage and to do it for them. You have to have patience and allow certain messiness and blips for people to develop. Stress is a huge one, and I'll come to that a little bit later. Being adaptable, anticipating what's going to happen is huge. One of the things they also mentioned, and the literature really backs this up, is consistency in terms of your emotional reaction. And other research has shown that people prefer a leader who is not particularly, nice, who might be quite aggressive, if they're that all the time, to a leader who's inconsistent, who blows hot and cold, because at least you know what to expect if you know the terrain. So consistency is hugely important. So, and I'm not suggesting consistency in terms of being aggressive, consistency, because people need to know how you're going to react. So consistency. And the other thing, and we talk about it a lot, is authenticity. But, you can't be authentic all the time. We'd probably have no friends if we're authentic all the time. It's what they call this kind of authenticity where the core of you is values driven. So if you're being inauthentic, and in the literature there's a huge amount on emotional labor, as leaders you have to act sometimes. You have to show you're calm when inside you're not. But if at the core of that, inauthenticity, is your values, is doing the job right, then that's okay. So it might be that you feign patience or support when you're not feeling that. That's okay because it's in order to do the job. But it's not okay to be inauthentic in terms of what you espouse versus what you enact. Does that make sense? So these are some of the things. The other thing that emerged was, during COVID, they really felt that they had additional pressures, and a lot of those related to people's mental health. So again, remember this is COVID, so there was huge uncertainty. I know from working in the university, I've never seen as much anxiety in my students, ever. And I'm seeing a parallel of high anxiety and low focus, actually. An inability to focus. And I do put some of it at the door of technology, in that I think everything is so fast that it becomes difficult to focus. And what these leaders were saying is that before, they didn't feel they were responsible for people's emotional well-being. But in COVID, they were shooted into people's sitting rooms. As one leader said, he said, I knew Jeremy had triplets, but now I really know Jeremy has triplets. And they kind of suddenly were living there with them. And that's a huge responsibility. And I'm seeing that as a lecturer, where I'm afraid sometimes to make hard decisions because I'm afraid of the consequences for individuals. So it is something that we're struggling with and that we're not trained to do. So this added burden with the 24/7 mentality that comes with technology, that we say we're not doing anymore, but that we are doing, causes a huge burden for leaders. And I think leaders have to live the life of hybrid as well. So, going back to the inequalities, you've almost this polarization of certain people being in the office, certain people not. And often leaders are in, and maybe they need to demonstrate hybrid behavior as well, because it's very symbolic. And and turn their phones off and not be as on and change the way things are done in terms of that. So there's a point in time where you have to say, have I fundamentally failed in setting something up that can't be managed without me? Your job is that it can, actually, that you are, more disposable than you would hope to be. So the emotional regulation that comes with realizing that self-care isn't fluffy and that it isn't non-leader-like, and there is still that idea. If you're not looking after yourself, you can't look after anybody else. So knowing what your triggers are, knowing that you're stressed, and knowing the consequences of that, what might happen down the line. A huge area in my work, I do a lot on bullying and incivility. And again, in times of crisis, incivility does increase, as does toxic leadership. Because when people are in precarious positions and unsure of what's going on and worried about their jobs, we get snippy. And that's contagious, and the culture can become one that's quite incivil. Not just managing our own emotions, but leaders are also required to manage others' emotions. And that's a really difficult job. And they really did struggle with that, because many of these leaders, became leaders because they were good at what they did. They were really good engineers. And they were struggling with this aspect. And there's literature that suggests that, there's what they call toxic decision-making. And if something is sensitive, and if something's ambiguous, and if something is non-urgent, we often just shelve it. So one of the examples, actually, that I had in class was a team leader who had somebody come to him from a team and say, look, one of the team members has hygiene problems, we need you to talk to them about it. So you've sensitive, you've got, ambiguous in terms of how do I deal with that? There's no script to deal with that. It's like bullying. We find often managers don't have a script to deal with that. It's hard. And it's non-urgent. And what they did was they just didn't deal with it until it had to be dealt with, because others dealt with it in a less appropriate way. So as leaders, you're now required to deal with those messy, sensitive, ambiguous areas that perhaps you didn't have to before. So really looking at things like empathy and perspective, taking other people's perspective, and that means meeting different people. And a lot of these leaders, one of the things they lamented during COVID was this lack of social networking, both internally, but they also felt it was hugely important to meet people externally, and that's why these events are so important, to see what other sectors are doing. You're all in tech, but what's going on in other sectors? And also, one of the pieces of research we do in UL is cross-domain leadership. And what we found is you can learn a huge amount from leading in sports or leading in your community. In fact, somebody said to me she learned more in leadership and negotiation by persuading her son to stay in college than she did in any, in any event in the workplace. But it's using that, thinking of, what have I learned from this? And Philip talked about that in his experiences in sport. What did I do there, and how can that work here? So diversity, political acumen. And one of the things, again, they found was problematic was remaining relevant globally during COVID. And also that, they felt that they're, being Irish and the Irish teams, that they had something that others didn't, that was being missed in translation by not being there. So keeping their regional hub relevant in a global space. And the word politics is often considered quite dirty and Machiavellian, but really they weren't talking about kind of skullduggery. They were talking about an awareness that there's agendas. Organizations are pluralistic. There's different agendas. There's negotiations to be done. There's often hidden agendas. And again, the literature suggests that political naivety is a problem. And there's research on gender and all sorts that suggests that sometimes people are reluctant to become politically savvy, but that can be to the detriment. So influencing up and down, trying to, perhaps have difficult conversations, both with your own leader and those who report to you. And also doing that internally and externally was a key one. We've talked about communication a huge amount here, but active listening, and I think previous speakers have stressed this. And many of the leaders actually said listening is a political skill, because if you listen, you find out what people are thinking and what they want, and that gives you the ability to be able to work with them. And yet, often that's really difficult when you're not in the same place as that person. So it's trying, the silences on teams. Silence is scary anyway, often, particularly if you're an extrovert. You want to fill it. But silence over teams is even more scary. But trying, listening to what's out there. And very often leaders are so busy speaking that they're not listening enough. And that was something they all said, we need to do more of this. Feedback, again, as I said, they struggled with that. How do I find out what's really going on? What's an explosion on the shop floor is a blip by the time it gets to you. How do I find out? And that is often going to people who, as I said, aren't that beholden to you, or are building trust with people and reacting to feedback in a way that means people, see, oh, this is something that's valued here. I always remember a head of department of mine, saying, and again, an amazing lecturer, we were walking to the canteen, and our performance management is student evaluations, and everybody's kind of, very fearful around them. And he was talking about a master's class who he thought he got on really well with, and then he got the evaluations and they were terrible. And by him voicing that, this leader that we knew to be competent and to be an excellent lecturer, it allowed us to speak of, of our own failures and our own fears and our own vulnerabilities, and to get feedback that is constructive but may not always be comfortable. Creating safe spaces, was another one that they came up with. And again, they looked at this very much in terms of the younger generation, providing opportunities to lead, but ones that were safe. So baby steps, where providing mentorship, but also providing mentorship to all. And again, what they were cognizant of was that sometimes you mentor people who you get on with. And that's very normal. And also there's a similarity attraction bias where we're attracted to people who are similar to us, who have similar values. But it often means that there's a cloning effect, and it often means that, the people who are on this fast track are a certain type of person, and that those opportunities aren't, not consciously, but aren't being given to all. So creating a safe space for all people to delve into leadership. But likewise, that as somebody said earlier, that everybody doesn't want to be a leader, and to have opportunities to lead and then move out of leadership. And that fluid, that kind of shared model of leadership, making that more real by inviting people at all levels to engage in certain leadership roles. I'm nearly finished because I know I'm sure you're all exhausted, but key things that they said for themselves. What they said was, when you get to a certain position in the organization, people think you don't need development opportunities anymore. And all of these people sought them out. They met people externally. They engaged in cross-domain experiences. One interviewee said he'd taken up tennis, and he was learning how to play tennis, and somebody was teaching it to him. And he said that experience taught him so much about leadership because he hadn't been a follower for so long. And he could see how this person was teaching him what worked, but what was really annoying, and he could see himself in that. And very often, if you're at a leadership position, you forget what it's like to be a follower. And putting yourself into that role, they found really, empowering and really enlightening. So this constant development and deep work, being uncomfortable, and this humility that is so necessary. And what a lot of them struggled with was this humility and authenticity in a world of self-promotion, I'm in academia. Self-promotion is huge. You know, you meet somebody in the corridor and you know how many papers they've published. And, you know, okay, we need to learn how to put ourselves out there, but also there becomes a time where it becomes, I think, self-defeating and off-putting for those coming up who see leadership, again, as this great man theory, that you have to be, you know, something, you know, incredible to lead. We might like to think you do, but you don't. You have to have integrity and want to learn. So to finish off, what these leaders felt was, you know, that their job was to pull back and pave the way, to coach and mentor and sponsor, and they're all subtly different, but they felt these were all hugely important in a very real sense, in a time sense. And so often, I know certain leaders, I know of particular professors in my university who've been so generous with their time with their students who are now professors in other universities, but it takes time. And, you know, that is, they identified that as hugely important, a hugely important part of leading that is often neglected, particularly now when there is this vacuum in leadership, perhaps, you know, coming up. But also, as I said, being a student, that knowing that you're constantly learning as a leader. So, you know, with confidence, I think, does come humility. And these leaders certainly demonstrated that, but they also demonstrated a huge thirst for continuing to develop and hone their leadership skills. So what do we have to be a brave leader in this new world, and what do we have to break? And their questions were very much around this changing mindset of leadership. We are programmed. There's a theory, you know, of the romance of leadership where we're programmed to think of leaders as heroic, you know, and coming in on a horse to save the day. And in times of crisis, we want that. You know, look at the leaders that are out there, that, you know, and yet that's not sustainable, and that's not always even an ethical style of leadership. But there is that struggle because we're socially programmed to want that and to expect that of our leaders. So what do we have to break, and how do we break that? I think that's it. That's it. Thank you very much.